one of the critical first steps to the management of tinnitus is for the patient to have a clear understanding of why they are experiencing tinnitus. Why am I hearing this ringing, buzzing sound in my ear? Why am I hearing this heartbeat sound in my ear? Why am I hearing this clicking sound in my ear? And the causes of those different experiences of tinnitus can be very, very different. And understanding what the consequences of that cause are very critical then in regards to the reaction that the patient has, right? So a classic example of this is, say you're laying in bed and it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you hear a creak in the floor and someone messing around the kitchen and the fridge and it wakes you up. Now, in one case, you could have family visiting, say your mom or your sister or cousins visiting, and you go, oh, that's just my mom. She couldn't sleep, so she's getting a glass of milk or something from the fridge. All right. In another case, though, you're home alone. There's no one else in the house. Now, in both those cases, the sound is the exact same. The creak in the floor, someone messing around the kitchen. The difference is whether that source is known and what is causing it, right? Because the known cause could have different implications for what the consequences of that sound. If it's just your mom or your family member, then the consequences are very minimal, so not a big deal. But if you don't know what the cause is, then that gets your brain into thinking, uh-oh, this could be a sign of danger. This could be someone here to hurt me, so on and so forth. So demystifying tinnitus and getting the patient to understand why they're experiencing tinnitus is very critical in the management of tinnitus.
When you explain this, it has to have the elements of what are the different root causes, what are the factors that contribute to why someone has it. And then, like you said, where is this going? What is my direction here? I need to have some element of control over this. Otherwise, I'm flooded with anxiety, stress, sleep problems, and tinnitus is front and center in my head. How do you approach your care? You still see patients. You're very close to the research in our community as well. Tell us more details about your approach and your perspectives here.
So the first step is very clearly a differential diagnosis. Breaking it down in regards to when did the patient's tinnitus onset, what were the relative factors to the onset of that tinnitus, ruling in, ruling out different factors such as noise exposure, medications, ear disease, but considering all those different factors relative to the onset of their tinnitus, head and neck injury, other issues as well, right? All things that we want to consider. And then beginning to then actually complete a comprehensive assessment of the patient to then correlate to those different potential factors that might be relative to the onset and perception of their tinnitus, as well as the reaction that they are having. So if you have a patient, and you're talking about primary tinnitus is the more common variant of tinnitus. Most patients describe as perceiving some type of ringing, buzzing, humming, variable type of sound. We're not talking about pulsatile tinnitus, like a heartbeat sound, or clicking tinnitus, which is commonly myoclonic activity. But ringing, buzzing, primary tinnitus, 9 times out of 10, a person's experiencing ringing, buzzing tinnitus because of reduced peripheral input into the auditory pathway. What is that most commonly? Exactly. What is that most commonly? That's hearing loss, right? That is the most common cause of tinnitus perception, is going to be that the sound getting up to the brain where we actually hear has been disrupted in some way. Now, there can be factors that create peripheral disruption. So, for example, a plug of wax in the ear. Damage to the inner ear due to noise exposure, or there could be a central pathology such as a tumor on the auditory nerve. The most common, though, is some type of disrupted input into that central pathway. Then we begin to look at some of these different factors. So, for example, an acoustic tumor, a vestibular schwannoma. These things always scare patients and going, uh-oh, this ringing could be a sign of a tumor. These things are extremely rare. We're talking about 0.0000002% of the population has vestibular schwannomas. That is more than likely not the reason why you are experiencing tinnitus. The much more likely reason is that you have some evidence of reduced peripheral input, meaning some level of auditory damage related to likely hearing loss and likely sensorineural hearing loss, which is the more common type of hearing loss in adults that has disrupted how sound is getting up to your brain. That disruption has created then a natural compensatory change the brain performs to try to compensate for the reduced amount of input. So if your brain's not getting the signal it was before, like your TV's not getting the signal like it was before, because some of the wires have been frayed, well, your brain is going to change to try to compensate. Unfortunately, your TV doesn't have a brain to try to compensate for that reduced input, so you're just changing the contrast on the TV or trying to change the color on it to get it to improve the quality of the picture, but very limited in doing so. And the brain's limited in doing so in terms of compensating for hearing loss. It can turn up its gain. It can increase neural firing. It changes its mapping around to try to compensate for that reduced input. But unfortunately, a very common side effect of those compensatory changes is creation of a neural static-like signal that is being sent to the auditory part of the brain, making it think a sound is there when a sound's not there. Tinnitus.
And are you saying that, number one, hearing changes, progressive hearing loss, loud noise exposure that leads to some hearing loss, even if it's mild, are you saying for most people who have tinnitus, that's the cause? And tell us a bit more about between the ear and the brain, where does the tinnitus live in your understanding of the research, brain imaging studies, understanding of the anatomy? Where does tinnitus reside exactly?
Sure. So indeed, the most common causes of an acquired form of tinnitus are going to be related to sensorineural hearing loss. And the most common causes of sensorineural hearing loss are noise exposure, age-related changes, and then some level of drugs that have some ototoxic properties like cisplatin and aminoglycosides. So when these different factors cause a change in peripheral input, they end up resulting in these compensatory changes we were describing, but in a chronic way, right? Because the input has been deprived in a chronic way. I know you're familiar with, and maybe some of the listeners are familiar with, that there's been numerous studies that have been completed over the decades, placing young, healthy adults in sound-treated spaces or in an anechoic sound chamber, which is like the quietest, environment we can make in the world. And if you leave someone in one of those rooms for 5-10 minutes, 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 will start experiencing ringing, buzzing in the ear. The vast majority will experience tinnitus, right? Now, are we causing a pathology to these healthy young adults by putting them into this sound-treated space? Of course not. What we've done is put them into an artificial environment. And the brain, the auditory part of your brain, expects sound. The real world is not silent, right? There's ambient sound around us at all time. But if that's disrupted in some way, even acutely, very briefly, the brain will begin to change to try to compensate for that brief change in what the input is. And so that's why these healthy young adults will experience tinnitus in a sound-treated space. Now, as soon as they come out of that room, their system's flooded with real sound again, so their tinnitus resolves. So what that tells us is that tinnitus itself is not a sign of danger. It is simply a sign that there's been disrupted input to the brain. All right. Where's that disruption at, and how that is, where is tinnitus actually happening in a pathway? Well, it's not happening necessarily in one place, right? So sensory neural hearing loss, for example, will involve damage to what we call hair cells. These are the sensory receptors of the inner ear. The primary damage tends to occur at the level of the outer hair cell. Another area where we see significant early evidence of damage is at the synapse. This is the place between the inner hair cell and the auditory nerve. that's in our world. We're recognizing synaptopathy, where there can be damage at the level of the outer hair cell and at the synapse. But that's why we call it sensory neural hearing loss, right? Because it's involving those two elements. So then along the brainstem and up to the brain, when there's tinnitus, we can see changes in activity as low as the cochlear nucleus. So the cochlear nucleus is the first level of the brainstem where the auditory nerve enters into the brain. And already at that low of a level, we can observe increase in neural firing, decrease in inhibition. So there's two major types of neurotransmitters, excitatory and inhibitory. Excitatory turn things on. This example is glutamate. Inhibitory turn things off, like glycine or GABA. Well, we start to see increases in glutamate and decreases in GABA and glycine, meaning that there's more excitation and less things that are turning things off when they're supposed to, right? Because the idea is to try to fill in the gap for the reduced input. So that's why many tinnitus patients will match the pitch of their tinnitus to a higher frequency, because that's more most commonly where their hearing loss is at and where their brain is trying to fill in the gap. So we can see changes at the level of the brainstem, all the way up to subcortical levels, all the way up to the auditory cortex itself, and beyond that as well. So tinnitus is not just a manifestation of changes in the physiology of the auditory pathway. It also involves non-auditory regions of the brain that are involved in our attention, that are involved in our memory, and that are involved in our emotional and stress-based responses. And that's why when a person is more stressed out, they're not getting sleep, they're having things going on in their life, more comorbidities, they have diabetes, they have heart, cardiovascular health issues. These individuals tend to have a stronger negative reaction to their tinnitus because these other portions of the pathway are ultimately driving the reaction to the tinnitus. The perception of the tinnitus we can relate to primarily the auditory pathway and at least the generation of that signal and its initial perception. Whether the person continues to perceive it and what their reaction is heavily dependent on non-auditory regions of the brain.
If you follow Treble Health and get value from these videos, I would highly recommend that you watch the full video from this clip right here, or subscribe to this clip's channel. Every little bit counts, and your support means the world to me. This is Dr. Ben Thompson with Treble Health.